everyone, Miss Carrie here from Miss Carrie's Creations. Today I'm going to show you how to use a standard A2 size background die and use it to create a slimline card background. So here I have a slimline card background, and I've cut a piece of craft paper that is as wide as that background and just a little bit longer. I'm going to be using the stitched lattice background thin cut. Now, can you believe I've had this thin cut for almost a year and I haven't used it yet? So I plan on keeping it out on my desk for a few weeks here before it retires. I'm going to place this piece of craft cardstock onto the die so that the top of the paper matches up with the top of the die. Now, this die does have some little holes in it, so I'm placing my craft paper down on the die so that none of those holes cut along the edges. I'm going to secure it in place with some Post-it tape. I am using a magnetic plate, but occasionally the die does shift, so this Post-it tape helps to hold that paper in place. I am making a few last-minute adjustments here, and then I'm going to place this down into my Sizzix machine between the two plastic plates. Now I'm going to roll the die through my machine, but I'm going to stop before I hit the edge of that die. So I have froze the video here so that you can see the little tiny edge of the die is peeking out. I am not going to push this all the way through. Instead, I'm going to roll it back towards me and remove the die from that craft cardstock. So I'm just going to go ahead and peel off the Post-it tape, clean this up a little bit, and you can see that the die has not cut all the way through at the bottom. We have just created the pattern along the top of this craft paper. The next step is to line this die up against the bottom half of the craft paper. Now, when you hold your die against that paper and kind of move it around a little bit, you can feel it slide into the pattern we created. So I'm going to go ahead and place this down on the bottom half of the cardstock. I have slid it into place so that the patterns match up, and then I'm going to grab another piece of Post-it tape to hold it in place. Now you can see that I have it sitting on top of my card base because I'm checking to see if it's going to be long enough after I have cut the bottom half of the die. Now this next part is important. You want to make sure that when you lie this die down in between the two plates, that top portion of the die is actually sticking out above the plates. You don't want any pressure to be placed on the top of that die. If it is, it will cut off the top half of your card, and we don't want that, do we? All right, so I'm going to sandwich the die in between the two plates, and as you can see, I do have the top portion of the die sticking out so that there is no pressure being applied on that part of the die. Now I'm going to run this through my die cut machine. If it is not going to be long enough for your card base, go ahead and stop at the end once again, move the die, and repeat the process. Mine is going to be long enough, so I'm just going to go ahead and roll it all the way through. All right, now all I have to do is remove the Post-it tape, clean up some of the little bits and pieces on this craft cardstock, and we have created a slimline card front using a standard A2 size metal die. This is something that you can do with almost all of your standard size background dies. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and just trim this down a small bit so I can create a nice white frame around the edge. And we're going to start putting this card together, and I'm going to show you how to shade your stamped images using metallic markers and watercolor paints. On the center of my card, I'm going to be placing my stamped images around this hexagon die cut. This has been cut out of our mix-ins papers. You can see there's a couple of different sizes here. I'll be using the 3.5-inch die. I'm going to be using stamped images from the Isabella Scrapbooking Stamp and Thin Cut set. This does have some matching thin cut dies that come with the stamps, and I'm going to be using 2 of the floral images today. So I've gone ahead and pulled out my stamping platform. I've placed down a piece of white daisy cardstock onto the platform, which is being held in place with magnets. And then I'm going to place down the 3 stamps that I plan on using. Now I'm just going to fold down the door to pick up the stamps, and then I'm going to go ahead and ink my stamps using some intense black ink. Now I like using a stamp platform occasionally because sometimes my stamps don't quite turn out the way I anticipated. As you can see here, when I came down the first time, I didn't add enough ink to that leaf image. Since everything stays nice and lined up on the stamping platform, all you have to do is re-ink those stamps, bring down the door one more time, and now you can see when I lift it up, that leaf image is stamped perfectly. I've gone ahead and used the matching thin cut dies to cut out each one of these floral images and the leaf. And now we're going to get ready to shade all of these images using our watercolor paints and metallic markers. So I've gone ahead and grabbed myself a plastic palette, and I'm going to be swiping some ink on that palette with the Spectrum Noir Metallic Silver Ignite marker. I'm going to be using this metallic marker as a watercolor paint. So I've grabbed myself a watercolor brush, and I'm adding water to that pigment to create a very thin silver ink. Using the shadows on the stamped image as my guide, I'm going to add this silver ink onto each one of the floral images. Now I have sped up the video quite a bit here because I didn't want you to have to watch this in real time. I'm just using that silver pigment to add some nice gray shading on both of the floral images. Now this card design was originally created for the Craft Roulette Challenge. The parameters this week were Slimline card, yellow +2, tasty treat, and polka dots. Now, if you've never heard of Craft Roulette, you need to check it out on YouTube. Each week, Merry Gun Fun goes live with a guest crafter. They spin a roulette wheel, which determines the parameters that they have to follow when they're creating their project. Now, unfortunately, I was unable to submit my card this week, and I'll explain why after I show you a close-up of this shaded floral image. So not only does that silver metallic marker add that nice gray shading, you can see just a hint of the metallic on that flower. And I love the way that looks. All right, I'm going to go ahead and repeat the process with the second flower. So not only does Craft Roulette have Merry Gun Fun and her guest crafter creating the project, they also encourage all of us to participate in the challenge. And like I said, I made this card for the challenge, but unfortunately, I was unable to submit. The rules said that I could only use yellow +2 colors. And as I was creating this card, I ended up adding a 4th color. So of course, I broke the rules. Surprise, surprise. So I was unable to submit this for Craft Roulette. But I did want to be able to still show you the process video because I wanted to share how to use that standard die to create a slimline card and how to use these metallic markers as watercolors. After adding the gray shading, I wanted to add a tiny hint of pink on the flowers. So I've grabbed the red Garnet Spectrum Noir Metallic Marker, and I'm just going to repeat the process of adding some water to that metallic pigment and then shading each one of the flowers. Now, because this is more of a watercolor look, I'm not filling in the flowers completely. I'm just adding little bits of color here and there on each one of the petals. I've used these Spectrum Noir Metallic Markers for quite a few things, but I have never used it as a watercolor before. So this little experiment is turning out just beautifully. So just in case you want to try this, the 2 markers I used were Silver Ingot and Red Garnet. Let's go ahead and take a look at these 2 flowers up close. You can see that it does give the impression of watercolors, but there's just a hint of that metallic pigment on each one of the flowers. All right, so now I'm going to finish shading the rest of the images using watercolor paints. I have sped up this portion of the video quite a bit once again You're going to be able to see how I mix and match all of the colors to shade the images, but I didn't want to do this in real time because the video would have been really long. So you can see there I've started out with the lemon. I just added some dark yellow over on the left side, and then I'm slowly fading out to a lighter yellow on the right. Now I've mixed a couple of green pigments and I'm shading in each one of the leaves. When I'm shading images with watercolor paints, I like to leave a little bit of the white cardstock showing through. This not only allows my watercolor pigments to kind of flow into that white space a little bit, it also adds a little bit of what looks like reflected light showing up on the images. As the watercolors flow across the image and start to dry, it helps to mute the tones just a little bit in that white space, and it allows the dark and light colors to mix together. All right, now that all of my images have been shaded with the metallic markers and the watercolor paints, let's go ahead and take a look at them up close. So we have that beautiful metallic tint in the flowers with the silver and the red garnet. And then we have the muted tones of the yellows and the greens in the watercolor paints. I think these go together really well. All right, now we're going to start assembling the card. So I'm going to start by adhering that die cut background onto a piece of ballerina cardstock. I do want to bring in some of that pink into the background that I added to the flowers. The pink around the edges was just a little bit too bright for me. I don't use pink very often, so I decided to tone it down using some Distress Oxide ink. Now, at this point, I realized that I ended up adding a fourth color. So I had the yellow in the lemon, which is also my sweet treat. I had the blue hexagon, which I was adding in the background. Right now I'm adding a little bit more Distress Oxide ink to it. I added the pink in the flowers, and then of course I added green on the leaves. So if I had shaded the leaves another color or had left off the pink, I would have been able to submit this for Craft Roulette. I'm going to start layering the card by placing my anchor piece down first. That is the blue hexagon, and it's going to go down onto the card using some thin 3D foam tape. The flowers are going to be layered in the upper right and the lower left. The lemon over on the left is going to create a horizontal line along the side of the card. Now I'm going to add a third floral image that I created off camera. I'm going to layer it beside that larger floral image, and then I'm going to tuck in that leaf image to create a beautiful little floral cluster in the lower left side of that hexagon. So I've created a couple of visual triangles here with the leaves and the flowers, but that lemon is kind of floating on its own. So I've grabbed the Isabella sticker sheet and I'm looking for another yellow element that I can add to my card. There's this little flag sticker with hints of yellow and green, and I'm going to be placing it in the upper left-hand corner. So now I've created a nice visual triangle with that flag, and I've added another yellow element onto the card. While I think about what I'm going to add for the third yellow element, I decided to work on the sentiment. This is going to be heat embossed, so I have patted my anti-static bag across the cardstock, and I'm going to be stamping a sentiment from the So Happy Together stamp set onto the sapphire cardstock using some Versamark ink. Now I'm going to sprinkle on some fine white embossing powder onto that Versamark ink. The anti-static pouch has prevented any excess powder from sticking where I don't want it to. I'm just going to double check that I don't have any little excess pieces on the cardstock, and then I'm going to go ahead and heat set the embossing powder with my heat tool. There's just something so satisfying about watching that embossing powder start to melt and create that beautiful raised image on your cardstock. I love the way white heat embossing looks on dark sapphire cardstock. I've gone ahead and trimmed down that sapphire cardstock, And I'm going to cut a little chevron over onto the right side of the sentiment. Now I'm going to be placing the sentiment tucked behind those flowers so that the loops in the letters go down in between the leaf and the flower image. I love overlapping loops and curves in letters with flowers. All of those curves and curls work together so beautifully. I want to add a half circle above the sentiment. Originally, I planned on using the gray one, but it has the word wonderful across it, which will end up being upside down if I use it. So I grabbed that blue floral one instead, and I'm going to tuck it up behind the sentiment. The little sprigs of berries around the flowers weren't quite standing out as much as I would like. So I'm going to be using some bisque liquid pearls to help them stand out just a little bit more. This is also going to bring in some more of that yellow color to the card. If you saw my recent video where I talked about different flower making tips, adding liquid pearls is one of the ways that I also add texture to a floral element. So if you take a look at this close up, you can see that I didn't fill in the black dots completely. There's still a little bit of black around each of those circles, but it just adds another level of dimension to this card. Like I always do, I added some stitching off camera. I added some zigzags across the flag at the top, and I added some matching zigzags in the lower right corner of the card. All right, so we have some yellow up in the flag and we have some yellow on the lemon, but I need to add another bold yellow element onto this card to form a visual triangle. So I've grabbed my yellow embellishment box and I'm just going to dig through and see if I can find anything that will work. I did find a little photo tab, but it wasn't quite the right color and it wasn't large enough. So instead, I've grabbed one of these spiral paper clips. I'm going to go ahead and bend it just a little bit before I tuck it up in the upper right side of the hexagon. Now I want to bring in a little bit more of that silver that's on the flowers, so I've grabbed some epoxy bubbles from my stash. This is a retired item. I have no idea how long I've had them, but they match this card really well and they add a nice element of dimension. They almost remind me of dewdrops. Off camera, I added some sapphire dots next to the sentiment. I almost left this out of the video, but I wanted to be able to show you how too many elements can make it hard for your eyes to flow across the card and can be distracting. So I've gone ahead and removed them. To add a fun little bit of whimsy to the card, I've tied a decorative knot in some polka dot ribbon and I'm adhering it onto that round paper clip using a glue dot. Adhering the ribbon onto the paper clip with a glue dot is much easier to do than it is to try to tie the ribbon around the paper clip. It looks like it's tied around the paper clip, but like I said, it's actually stuck on there with a glue dot. The last little element I decided to add were some thread bundles. I've gone ahead and tucked these up behind some of the flowers and under the leaf using some glue dots. And now all that's left is to adhere this card front onto the Slimline card base, and this card is complete. And here is that completed Slimline card that I created for the Craft Roulette Challenge. Now if you take a look, I did change that blue half circle into a sage colored half circle. It matches that flag and the leaves a lot better than the blue one did. I did enjoy showing you how to create this background using the standard A2 size card making die. So I hope that you use that technique on one of your future Slimline cards. I also showed you how to shade these images using metallic markers. They were stamped using that Isabella scrapbooking stamp set. There were so many fun techniques that I was able to show you on this Slimline card. I only wish I had, once again, remembered to follow the rules so I could have submitted it for the Craft Roulette Challenge, but maybe next time. I want to thank you for joining me today for another card making tutorial. I hope that you learned a couple of new techniques that you plan on using on your future card making adventures. If you would like to see any of my other card making tutorials, you can go ahead and click on that playlist above. While you're at it, go ahead and click that subscribe button so that you are notified when I add another video tutorial to this channel. I hope you have a wonderful week. I can't wait to see what you create.